The monsoon had come 3 weeks early that season, catching trekkers and guides across the Lantang Valley unprepared. The weather forecasts from Kathmandu had been wrong, a common occurrence at that altitude, where mountains created their own atmospheric laws. Tenzin, a local guide with 23 years of experience navigating these slopes, had warned James about the shift in wind patterns 2 days prior. The American had listened but hadn't fully comprehended what it meant. Tourism had changed the Himalayas, but the mountains remained fundamentally indifferent to human schedules. James was 54, a retired academic photographer with a passion for undocumented historical sites. He had spent his career photographing Mayan ruins, ancient trade routes, and forgotten monasteries across Southeast Asia. This trek through the Lantang Valley was supposed to be his final expedition, a chance to document what locals called the hidden temples, structures that predated modern maps and official historical records. Tenzin had been recommended by a colleague in Pokhara, reliable, discreet, and knowledgeable about paths that didn't appear in guidebooks. They were descending the ridge near the high pass when the storm hit with unexpected violence. One moment, the sky was gray but manageable. The next, it turned slate black, and rain fell sideways with the force of something solid. Lightning cracked so close they felt the air burn around them, a sensation like standing too near an open furnace. Thunder followed, not in seconds, but in simultaneous booms that seemed to split the world open. Tenzin grabbed James's arm and pointed toward a cliff face perhaps 60 meters away, a weathered granite wall that had endured centuries of monsoons. "There," Tenzin shouted over the roar of rainfall. "Natural shelter!" They ran, slipping on wet rock, their boots struggling for purchase. The wind pushed them sideways, and twice James stumbled, saved only by Tenzin's grip on his jacket. They reached the cliff face gasping, pressing their bodies into what they assumed was a solid rock wall. Rain continued to fall with apocalyptic intensity, creating a curtain that obscured everything beyond 20 meters. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to originate from within the mountain itself. Not the sharp report of lightning striking stone, but something more fundamental, a groan of geological stress. James felt it through his palms, through his boots, through his entire body. The cliff face shuddered. The section of weathered stone that had seemed solid moments before gave way beneath the force of cascading water. Centuries of freeze-thaw cycles, decades of monsoon erosion, the weight of water flowing through invisible fissures, all of it culminated in a single moment of structural failure. A section of rock roughly 4 meters wide and 3 meters tall fractured and tumbled inward, revealing a jagged opening that had been invisible moments before. What had been a smooth cliff wall was now a seam in the mountain, a mouth opening to something hidden since before recorded history. The dust that erupted from the opening was thick and acrid, carrying the scent of deep stone and mineral deposits undisturbed for centuries. James coughed, shielding his face with his arm. Tenzin stood motionless, staring at the darkness beyond. Inside, partially visible by the gray daylight filtering through dust, stood 6 statues. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, as if the mountain had expelled its rage and now settled into contemplative silence. Rain became drizzle, then mist, then merely dampness in the air. The sky, instead of clearing, seemed to deepen into a twilight gray that made checking a watch feel irrelevant. Time moved differently at this altitude, in this light. James approached the opening cautiously, testing each footfall on stone that was slick with mineral deposits and ancient saltwater residue. His flashlight beam was narrow and gold-colored in the darkness. The moment it caught the face of the nearest statue, he stopped breathing. The figure was serene, meditative, carved in a seated position with hands folded in a gesture Tenzin immediately recognized and named. "Buddhist," Tenzin whispered, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "But not modern. This stonework is old, very old, not from this century, not even from the last." The statues were neither small nor enormous, human-sized, carved from a uniform pale stone that suggested a single quarry, a single sculptor's intention. But what made James's hands tremble was what covered them. Gold leaf, corroded and darkened by age but unmistakably precious. The gold had oxidized into a greenish patina in places, creating an otherworldly landscape of texture and temporal depth. Salt crusts covered the statue's bases like frozen waves. Mineral deposits from underground springs accumulated over decades or centuries, creating pedestals that seemed to blur the boundary between statue and earth. The air inside the chamber smelled of metal, stone dust, and something else, a faint, almost metallic sweetness that suggested oxidized copper or aged earth exposed to moisture and mineral-rich water. The temperature was cool and constant, the kind of environment that preserved rather than decayed. James's breath became visible as pale mist in the light of his flashlight. They were hidden deliberately, Tenzin said, moving deeper into the chamber with slow, reverent steps. Not abandoned. Hidden. There is a difference. The 6 statues were arranged in a semicircle, as if facing an invisible audience or perhaps a shrine that no longer existed. Each was different in subtle ways. Some bore traces of original pigment beneath the gold, faded reds and blues that suggested they had once been painted with detailed robes and ornaments, scenes from sacred narratives now barely legible beneath centuries of mineral accumulation. One statue's base was carved with symbols that resembled Tibetan script, though weathered beyond full legibility. Another bore what appeared to be Hindi characters, suggesting this site had been a convergence point for multiple religious traditions. James moved from statue to statue, his camera raised but not yet shooting. He needed to understand first, to observe, to let the space speak before attempting to document it. The gold covering appeared deliberate, not haphazard, not natural, but chosen and applied with intention. Someone, centuries ago, had chosen to coat these figures in precious metal and then seal them in stone, sacrificing their visibility to ensure their survival. "Why here?" James asked, his voice sounding small in the chamber. "Why hide them?" Tenzin ran his fingers along the nearest statue's base, careful not to touch the gold itself. This valley was a trade route once, before the modern roads. Silk Road, they call it, but also something else. Sacred sites, hidden from invaders, from those who would destroy them during times of conflict. The light from James's flashlight caught something else, a stone tablet, partially buried beneath salt accumulation, leaning against the far wall of the chamber. On its surface, characters that might have been instructions or warnings or prayers. The stone was darker than the statues, carved with deliberate pressure, the kind of inscription meant to last through ages. James approached it slowly, documenting each detail with his camera before attempting to examine it closely. The tablet was roughly rectangular, perhaps 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Its edges were smoothed by time, but its face remained clear, the carved characters still sharp enough to cast shadows in his flashlight beam. "Can you read this?" he asked Tenzin. The guide stepped forward, squinting at the inscription. Some of it, Old Tibetan, I think, mixed with something else. Sanskrit, perhaps. It speaks of guardians, of a monastery that once stood higher, on the pass, of statues that were moved. He paused, his finger tracing a particular line of characters. During a time of conflict, during invasion. Chapter 2. The Decision. They emerged from the cliff chamber at dusk, as shadows lengthened across the valley and the temperature began its sharp decline. The mountain air was thin and cold, each breath a conscious effort at this altitude. James's mind was already racing with implications that cascaded like the storm's water had. 6 gold-covered statues of Buddhist origin, hidden in a sealed chamber for possibly 500 years or more. The historical significance was staggering, the kind of discovery that rewrote regional history, that connected cultures across trade routes and centuries. The monetary value was irrelevant by comparison, a distraction, almost an insult to what they had found. But Tenzin was quiet. Too quiet. They sat on a large boulder overlooking the valley, the last light of day painting the distant peaks in shades of orange and deep purple. Tenzin's face was thoughtful, troubled even. "We should tell authorities," James said, feeling the need to break the silence. "Museums, UNESCO, archaeologists. This needs proper documentation, official protection. This is too important to keep secret. Tenzin was silent for a long moment, looking out toward the valley below, toward the distant villages where smoke rose from cooking fires. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and heavy with experience. "You think they will protect this place?" "What do you mean?" "Of course they will. International law, heritage preservation, cultural protection." Yes. Tenzin interrupted gently. "And then what? Once people know treasure is here, they come. Not just scholars, thieves come, developers come, government officials come, each claiming different authority, different rights. This valley is remote, but not that remote anymore. I have seen it before, many times. Sacred places become museums, museums become tourist sites. In 5 years, there are roads cutting through the forest. In 10 years, hotels. In 15 years, a cable car." James felt the weight of the decision settling on him like the cold settling on the peaks. Tenzin was describing a pattern he had witnessed, a transformation that happened with bureaucratic inevitability. The very act of revealing this discovery could doom it, not to destruction necessarily, but to transformation, to loss of its isolation, its sanctity, its power to exist outside the modern world's economy of experience and extraction. "Then what do we do?" James asked. "Leave it sealed? Pretend we never found it?" Tenzin picked up a stone, turned it over in his weathered hands. His palms were marked by decades of rope and exposure, the hands of someone who had earned his knowledge through physical engagement with terrain. "We go back," Tenzin said slowly. "We look more carefully. We understand what we found before we decide who needs to know. The statues have waited centuries. They can wait a few more days while we determine the right path." James wanted to argue. He wanted to photograph everything in high resolution, file detailed reports, contact universities and foundations, secure the site officially. But something in Tenzin's reasoning held him, the wisdom of someone who had seen how good intentions transformed into unintended consequences, how preservation sometimes required strategic concealment. "How long?" James asked. 2 days, Tenzin replied. "We return to base camp, we rest, we gather better equipment. Then we go back and document everything properly. We understand the full story before we share it." James nodded, though part of him remained uncertain. The academic in him wanted immediate verification, peer review, official documentation. But the photographer in him understood something deeper. Sometimes the greatest images, the most important truths required patience and perspective before sharing them with the world. Chapter 3. The Investigation. The second descent into the cliff chamber was methodical, almost ceremonial in its precision. James had returned to base camp and raided his supplies, a proper archaeological kit borrowed from a colleague years ago and never returned, sketch paper of archival quality, a camera with high-resolution capability and multiple lenses. Tenzin had brought something equally valuable: history, patience, and the ability to move through sacred spaces with reverence. They entered the chamber in the late afternoon, when sunlight still penetrated the valley, but shadows were deepening. The statues seemed to have shifted in their memories, to have become both larger and more delicate than James recalled. Tenzin moved through the space like a man returning to a place of pilgrimage, touching stone only where it would not compromise integrity, never the gold leaf itself, never the carved faces or hands. The tablet became their immediate focus. Tenzin traced the characters with his finger, struggling with the ancient script. His lips moved silently as he translated piece by piece, allowing the meaning to emerge gradually, rather than forcing interpretation. "It speaks of guardians," Tenzin said eventually, "of monks who maintained these statues, of a monastery that stood higher, on the pass above here. They moved the statues down during a time of conflict, during invasion." He paused, running his finger over a particularly worn section of carving. "It says they were moved to preserve them, that the monastery would fall, but the statues would survive." "Do you know when?" James asked, already photographing the tablet from multiple angles. "Do the dates make sense?" 16th century, I think. Maybe 17th. The script is old enough, but I cannot be certain. The invasion, it could be the Mughal expansion or it could be earlier conflicts between Buddhist kingdoms. This region has many layers of history. James photographed each statue from multiple angles. Close-ups of the carved faces, medium shots showing the gold coverage, wide shots establishing the chamber's geometry and arrangement. He measured meticulously, approximately 15 feet deep, 12 feet wide. The ceiling natural rock unchanged by human tool. The statues had been positioned here strategically, oriented toward the entrance as if awaiting rediscovery, as if the monks who had sealed them in this chamber had imagined a future when they would be found again. Above each figure, scratched into the stone, were numbers or marks. A catalog, perhaps. An inventory system. Evidence of intentional organization rather than random placement. Someone had counted these statues, numbered them, recorded their position and significance. This was not a hidden cache of forgotten objects. It was a deliberately preserved archive. One statue was markedly different. Its gold covering had eroded more than the others, revealing patches of the original stone beneath. The erosion created an accidental portrait of aging, of how time worked differently on different surfaces. Carved into its chest, below where a robed figure would be, was a symbol repeated at least 12 times in a circular pattern around the torso. A sun, a seal, a mandala. The symbol's meaning escaped immediate interpretation, but its prominence suggested special significance. This one was marked, Tenzin said, his voice carrying new weight. Special, perhaps the most important, perhaps the guardian of the others. As James sketched the symbol carefully into his notebook, he noticed something the centuries had almost erased. A small cavity carved into the statue's base, hidden by angle and shadow, protected from direct water flow by an overhang of stone. It was empty now, hollow and dark. But it had held something once, something small enough to fit in a palm. Something precious enough to warrant special protection within protection. Someone had carved a hidden chamber within a hidden chamber, a final sanctuary for an object whose identity was now lost to time. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Rival. They emerged from the chamber at midday to find the landscape had transformed. A second camp was established 50 meters away, positioned with deliberate visibility, a declaration of presence. A man in his 60s, weathered by mountain climbing and expedition life, was sitting beside a portable stove brewing tea with the unhurried movements of someone comfortable with waiting. He was not alone. Two younger men flanked him, guides or porters, possibly something less formal. Their posture suggested they were experienced in mountain work, but also in something else, something harder to name. Tenzin, the man called out as they approached. His accent was European, Dutch or German, James thought, though filtered through years of international expedition work. I wondered when you would show yourself here. I have been watching the valley. I saw the rock fall from my position yesterday. Tenzin's entire body language shifted. His jaw tightened, his hands tensed. James immediately understood there was a story he did not yet know, a history that carried weight and complicated emotion. Hirin, Tenzin said, the name delivered like an acknowledgement of something inevitable. An old friend of yours? James whispered, though he already sensed the answer. An old competitor, Tenzin replied quietly. Hirin has been searching for hidden monasteries in this region for 15 years, always believing there is treasure to be found, always one step behind the truth. Hirin stood with surprising grace for a man his age, extending his hand. His grip was firm and deliberate, the kind of handshake designed to establish dominance through pressure. His eyes were intelligent, calculating, the eyes of someone who had made decisions in difficult circumstances and learned to live with the consequences. Gentlemen, Hirin said, his smile professional and sharp. I have been expecting company. The storm yesterday was quite remarkable, yes? I noticed the rockfall from my position here. Interesting timing. Very interesting. James remained silent, following Tenzin's lead. Silence, he was learning, was sometimes the most eloquent response. I have permissions from local officials, Hiran continued, pulling a folder from his tent. I am documenting historical sites for a German archaeological foundation. Well-funded, well-connected. Anything you find here, and I suspect you have found something significant, we should report together, collaboratively, for the good of preservation and international scholarship. It was a trap disguised as reasonableness, a net woven from professionalism and appeals to shared academic values. James could feel it in his chest, the manipulation beneath the surface civility. If they admitted what they had found, Hiran would claim co-discovery at minimum. At worst, he would seize control of documentation and access, use his foundation's resources to push them to the margins of their own discovery. We found nothing, Tenzin said flatly. Just shelter from the storm. We continue to base camp now. Hiran's smile did not falter, but something cold passed through his eyes. Of course. Safe travels. Though I suspect we may meet again on this mountain. The mysteries here have a way of attracting those who know how to look for them. As James and Tenzin packed their gear deliberately slowly, as if they had not been disturbed by the encounter, they both knew the illusion of isolation was shattered. Hiran would not leave the valley empty-handed. He would search, he would find, he would report. The race had begun, though neither side had acknowledged it directly. Chapter 5. The storm returns. They made it back to base camp by evening, but the weather was deteriorating with alarming speed. The monsoon front that had passed was being followed by a deeper, more violent system. Atmospheric patterns that the guides at base camp spoke about with a mixture of fear and resignation. Unseasonable cold pushing down from Tibet, atmospheric pressure changes that made the peaks dangerous and unpredictable. The old porters crossed their arms and looked at the sky, reading the signs in wind patterns and cloud formations that Western meteorology often missed. Tenzin made a decision that James understood immediately. They could not allow Hiran unfettered access to the chamber. They could not risk the rival excavating, photographing, and filing his own reports before the proper authorities could be contacted. They had perhaps 12 hours before the weather made climbing impossible, perhaps 24 before Hiran organized his own expedition. We go back up, Tenzin announced. Tonight, while the path is still clear enough. We take photographs, documentation, everything. We preserve the record before anyone else can. James was exhausted, the kind of deep fatigue that accumulates from high altitude, emotional tension, and constant physical exertion. But he understood. They packed by lamplight, moving with purpose. Cameras, rope, additional provisions, documentation materials. The climb back to the cliff took 3 hours in near total darkness, following a path Tenzin navigated by something deeper than memory. Something closer to instinct born from 23 years of these mountains. When they reached the chamber, the air inside felt colder, as if the mountain itself had withdrawn its warmth. They moved with practiced efficiency born from necessity. James photographed every angle methodically, developing a system. Wide shots for context, medium shots for detail, close-ups for texture and deterioration patterns. He recorded measurements, noted color variations in the gold leaf oxidation, documented the salt formations with meticulous care. Tenzin sketched the tablet, copying characters by flashlight onto archival paper. His hand steady despite the physical exertion and emotional weight of the moment. They carefully excavated the base of the marked statue, the one with the empty cavity, revealing its secret more completely. The small hidden chamber became visible, approximately 4 inches deep, 6 inches wide. Empty now. But the floor around it held something. Fragments of what might have been wood or cloth or leather, degraded far beyond identification but suggesting that something precious had been stored there. Something small and valuable enough to warrant special protection within protection, chamber within chamber. Outside, the wind began to howl with increasing intensity. A real storm forming, not the brief violence of the previous day. The sound echoed through the cliff face like a living thing, like the mountain itself was awakening. and then unmistakably the sound of falling rock. Not close yet, but the mountain was shifting, responding to pressure and stress accumulation, beginning to surrender its loose elements to gravity and wind. "We need to leave," Tenzin said, and there was urgency in his voice now, the urgency of someone who understood that geological processes operated on their own timeline. As they moved toward the entrance, gathering their documentation, James turned back one final time. The statues sat in the darkness, patient and serene, their gold catching his flashlight beam one last time. They seemed almost to be watching him go, as if they had expected this brief moment of interruption in their centuries of solitude, this glimpse of the modern world before returning to shadow and isolation. He understood, in that moment, why Tenzin had been reluctant to immediately report the discovery. Some things were meant to remain hidden, waiting in darkness for a future moment that might never come. Chapter 6. The Legacy. 3 days later, from a secure location in Kathmandu, sitting in a modest government office overlooking the Kathmandu Valley, James and Tenzin submitted their documentation to a carefully selected international organization, not the German expedition, but an Indian university-based archaeological foundation with strong regional connections, a commitment to preservation over commercialization, and a track record of protecting sacred sites from exploitation. The photographs were clear and comprehensive, the product of hours of meticulous documentation. The sketches of the tablet were precise enough for professional translation by specialists in ancient Tibetan and Sanskrit. The measurements were accurate to the centimeter. The evidence of a sealed monastery from the 16th or 17th century was irrefutable. The kind of discovery that would appear in academic journals and reshape regional historical understanding. Within 2 weeks, a formal expedition was being organized. Official protection was being sought from the Nepali government. International committees were being convened. The statues would be documented, studied, and some might eventually be displayed in museums, but not yet. Not immediately. The chamber would be sealed again, professionally this time, protected against the elements while remaining accessible to serious scholarship. But that came later, in the future, in the world of institutions and official processes. In the present moment, sitting in a Kathmandu cafe near the Buddhanath Stupa, Tenzin and James discussed what they had discovered beyond the gold and the antiquity. The statues had survived invasion, earthquake, and decades of monsoon erosion. They had been hidden deliberately by monks who understood something fundamental, that sometimes the greatest protection comes through concealment, that the most important things are preserved not through display but through careful hiding. "The gold leaf," James said, cradling a cup of tea between his palms. "We determined it was a preservation technique, correct? Not merely ornamentation?" Tenzin nodded. The monks understood minerals. They understood how metal seals against moisture. The gold was not wealth displayed. It was preservation technology. They were protecting the stone beneath, maintaining what they treasured. And the empty cavity? James pulled out his notebook, reviewing his sketches of the marked statue, the one with the hidden chamber within the chamber. "That," Tenzin said carefully, "is a question that may never be answered. Perhaps someone will study the depository more carefully, analyze traces of what was kept there. But perhaps not. Perhaps it was meant to be empty, the absence itself significant, the object removed deliberately when the statues were sealed, kept separate for safety." James looked at a photograph of the marked statue on his camera's display screen. The image showed the serene face, the green patina of oxidized gold, the symbols carved into the chest in their circular pattern. The true value of the discovery was not the gold itself, though that was remarkable. It was what the statues represented, the last witnesses to a monastery that had stood for centuries in these mountains, protecting knowledge and faith and sacred traditions in an isolated corner of the Himalayan world. "Do you think Hiran will discover the chamber?" James asked. Tenzin smiled slightly. "The storm blocked the upper pass yesterday. The rockfall from yesterday sealed the lower approach. Perhaps Hiran will find the statues eventually, but I suspect the mountain will ensure it takes him longer than he expects. The mountain protects what it chooses to protect." The monsoon continued outside the cafe, rain hammering the windows with rhythmic intensity. Traffic moved slowly through the streets below. Motorcycles splashed through puddles. The city continued its ordinary existence, oblivious to the significance of what had been discovered and carefully preserved in the mountains above. "What happens now?" James asked. "We wait," Tenzin replied. "We let the process work. We gave the discovery to those who will honor it. That is all we can do. The statues have waited 500 years. They can wait a little longer while the world decides how to respect what they represent." James nodded, understanding that sometimes the greatest adventure was not in discovery itself, but in the choice to prioritize preservation over glory, to protect history rather than profit from it. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.